Hello, everybody out there in guitar land. This is George Groom Guitars, for our question and answer session on July 30, 2021. The market is still alive and well, plenty of activity. Sometimes it seems like, though I've never seen a time when there was so much disruption in the supply chain, and that hasn't changed. We have a few empty hooks on the wall, but most of those are getting filled pretty quick because we did have the foresight to order heavily a year ago. So at a time when many were uncertain how long the pandemic would last, we figured that it would be over within a year. And the fact is, the pandemic isn't really over in a year. It's still very much there. However, people are back buying. And while not everybody is vaccinated, fortunately, I think a lot of our good customers are vaccinated and taking good care of themselves. And the market is rebounding. Not only are new instruments selling well, but good vintage instruments are selling, often for prices not seen since the market bubble burst back in '08, and in some cases definitely above and beyond what they brought back then. So it's not only recovered to pre-pandemic levels, but it has, in many cases, recovered to pre-market bubble burst levels, which is quite a different factor. And we've discussed some of that earlier. But at any rate, I think we'll be in no lack of things to talk about for the day. But we certainly do have room for more questions, hopefully, which will be accompanied by answers. So if you have any questions, this is a great time to send them in so that I can respond to them today. So the more, the better. We have a number of interesting instruments that have come in that I'd like to show before I get to some of the questions. One that's a rather interesting guitar is a 1928 L1 Gibson. And this has a work order batch 9129, produced August 1928. This one is a model measuring 13.5 inches wide at the lower bout. And typically this model has a sort of A-brace pattern, not X-braced. But this particular instrument is X-braced and is, to the best of my knowledge, the earliest known X-braced Gibson flat top guitar. It's a great sounding instrument in beautiful condition. We did have to do a neck set on it to get it in good playing order, but that came out perfectly. Still has the original frets, original case. The instrument plays extremely well and sounds absolutely great. In fact, it is the best sounding, best playing example of this particular body size L1 that I have ever encountered. But it still works out that even now, after 51.5 years in business with a store and collecting guitars since 1963, I'm still running across guitars the likes of which I've never seen before. There's no end to how much there still is yet to be learned. And I certainly can't claim to know it all. The older I get, the more I find out how much I still have to learn. which is enough to keep it interesting. If I knew everything, nothing was new, that would be boring. It might be profitable if I knew everything, but I cannot, in truth, claim that that is the case. I'm still learning, and often enough, while learning, that means that one has to change a pre-existing opinion. So here's an example again of a guitar. It is a learning experience for me, and is indeed also a great instrument. So from a market point of view, this is a fine guitar, although it was not particularly expensive when new. It was still a very well crafted, extremely fine sounding instrument. I'll get on to a question that was submitted by Mitch. And he says that I'm curious about the rare ES250 model that was only built from 1939 through 1940. I have seen it first pictured in the 1939 Gibson catalog with a regular production trapeze tailpiece and what looks like the stair-step headstock shape, but I'm not completely sure. It's a, or is it a normal shape? Well, it is the stair-step shape in that catalog. That catalog page is a copy of that catalog page. B is the ES250 along with the ES150, which is sometimes called the Charlie Christian model, and the matching ES150 amplifier, EH, often EH for electric Hawaiian, ES for electric Spanish. But that's the 150 amp with tweed covering and orange and black stripes. The 150 measured 16 inches wide, and the 250 was 17 inches wide. And typically the 250 had 6 bars on the pickup. But at any rate, interesting guitar. It says, I've seen a couple pictures showing Charlie Christian playing a sunburst one and a blonde one. I think it belonged. They belonged to him, and they both had tail pieces that were much like the Super 400, but without the model name engraved attached on it. There was a photo in Guitar Player magazine's Encore page showing a blonde 250 with half circle fingerboard inlays and no first fret inlay, and a non-stair step Peghead along with a Sunburst 250 with open book fingerboard inlays, including at the first fret, with the stair step Peghead. I've always thought this burst pictured in Encore being the basic 250. Well, the one in the catalog is indeed a basic 250. However, there were lots of variations. And the fact is, it was made in very small quantities for only a brief time. So Joe Spann, who works with me on appraisals and has written a very definitive book about Gibson history, makes the following observations. Based on shipping ledgers, Gibson only shipped out a total of 110 ES250 model guitars between 39 and 40. Catalog description called for sunburst finish, but there are 7 examples documented in the shipping ledgers with natural finish. This means that an ES250 is only slightly less rare than a pre-World War II Martin D45, and as much as 3 times more rare than Gibson Lloyd Loar F5 with 246 known units and suspected total production maybe 275. The specifications of the 250 were set out in the 39 catalog, but were really not rigidly followed. They came with sunburst or natural, 19 fret fingerboard on the early examples, 20 fret fingerboard on later examples, double parallelogram or enclosed frame inlay like a 37L7. Some had that. unbound stair-step peghead or the open book peghead, more typical Gibson with single white binding. Both seem to have been used. Metal trapeze-style tailpiece with the pointed ends and raised diamond and arrows, or that later version with the tailpiece. It was somewhat like a like the Super 400. But the 250 model appears only in the 39 catalog. Catalog AA does not appear on the 39, 40, or 41 Gibson dealer price lists. So it was something that was a very limited run instrument, and the price may have been a bit flexible. But the first 250 shipped on shipping ledgers was September 26th of 39. First one with natural finish appeared February 6, 1940. But all 110 of the ES250 models were initially shipped between September 26, 39 and February 6 of 40. January 31st of 41. So all were shipped between September 26 to 39 till January 31st of 41. So that's a period of only 16 months. But Gibson accepted dealer returns if things didn't sell, and they would do factory refurbishing. So some of these were shipped out sporadically as late as 1948. The fact that it didn't last long, basically a number of factors that Joe points out. First, it had a very high return rate for repairs. About 40% of them were returned to the factory for repair within a year of being sold, but the cause of that is not known. It's not clearly stated what repairs were being done other than they were sent back for repair. The other thing is that Gibson made a lot of different models, and some of them just simply didn't have a well-defined market. They have a long history of creating more models, sometimes with too many corresponding price points. That's true for banjos, electric guitars, acoustic guitars, mandolins. The hierarchy of the best sellers was typically an entry base model, which sold the most. Same model with enough upgrades to be considered professional grade, which generally was second in sales volume. And far behind the other two are highly upgraded, fancy grade, ornamented, professional grade instrument, which typically didn't really play or sound that much different or better, but looked plenty spiffy on stage. But those didn't sell in large quantities. When the 250 debuted in 39, the entry-level archtop electric was the ES100, which was priced at $49. The upgraded sort of professional guitar, the ES150, was priced at $77.50. And the pro guitar, the ES300, which never did prove to be very popular, it had a weird diagonal pickup, was priced at $300. But this sort of left the 250 priced at $150 without a clearly defined market. Professional musicians typically got the features they needed on a 150 model, and why pay almost double as much when you're just getting some fancier inlays and triple edge binding and a bigger body, which you don't need if you're plugging in. At any rate, that's sort of what we can say, but it's somewhat speculative because a lot of the reasons why the instruments were returned or why they didn't sell well back then were never recorded in any written documentation. So we can surmise that that is logical, but when it comes right down to it, it's not clearly documented, and we will probably never know all the answers to that question. There's another question, which I'm going to turn over to Greg Voros, our repair shop foreman, about neck sets. So here he is.
Hey guys, hope everyone's okay and everyone could hear me. I'm Greg Voros. Nice to see everyone again. So one of the questions that came in, I believe it was this morning, was from Jeffrey. The question is, I have a technical question regarding a neck reset for an acoustic guitar. If one places a 24-inch ruler across the frets, the plane of the fret top should line up closely with the top of the bridge. Okay, we're all on the same page and it makes perfect sense. If it lines up below the top of the bridge, a neck reset is indicated according to many of the guitar repair manuals. Truth. However, can it also be that the reason that the ruler lines up below the top of the bridge is because of the belly of the guitar has risen due to years of string tension? Again, yes. And not because of the angle of the neck has changed. That's the kicker right there. Okay, so why does an instrument need a neck reset? Let's cover that. So after about 30 or 40 years of string tension on any acoustic instrument, okay, over that time, what winds up happening is that the box or the body of the instrument itself contorts. Okay, so you can have excessive bellying, you can have a contorted sound hole, you can have a lot of different movements that a box can make over the years as the string tension pulls on it. One of the major ones is a dip right past the extension, right near where the sound hole is. It'll drop just a little bit, and that should kick the belly and accentuate the belly even more for string pull. So really the body contorts, and that's why a neck reset is required to reset that neck to its newly contorted body. Okay, so technically, with the question, however, can it also be that the reason the ruler lines up below the top of the bridge is because the belly of the guitar has risen due to the years of string tension? Yes, that's why it needs a neck reset. Okay, if you are going to take this measurement by either sighting it, depending on what model, what kind of bridge and what kind of radius the instrument is and how much the top is going to pull, but if a 24-inch ruler across the frets to check for its angle is exactly the way you do it, but it has to be tuned to tension. It has to be strung to pitch. If the instrument is strung to pitch, then that ruler could be used, and that's exactly where you want to clear it. As a matter of fact, it should go a little bit past that. The rule that we use of thumb is if you don't have string tension on the instrument and you put the straight edge right over the frets, it should actually rub on a Martin guitar. It should rub on the bridge right near where the G string would come out of the pin. So as the bridge is radiused, it's tapered going to the bass side. It actually moves up, tapered away going towards the treble side. The proper neck set angle would be for the straight edge to actually rub the top of the bridge itself before it hits the saddle. It should bump up against it. That should give you a saddle reveal once the instrument is tuned to pitch, okay, of about 330 seconds across the top. I see sometimes folks overset necks and a little bit more than that is exposed over the top on a Martin guitar. I never want to see that. An overset instrument on any guitar, especially a Martin, Gibson, whatever it might be, it squeezes the instrument. You wind up top loading it way too much. But yeah, so this is all very very good, and I hope that answered your question, Jeffrey. All right, let's have George come back on the program here. Until next time, guys.
Okay, we are back. And it's a fellow named George asking me, George says, "Hi, George, I'm considering buying a 1954 Guild Aristocrat M75 guitar. I was hoping you can shed some insight regarding the pros and cons pertaining to this model. I'm mainly interested in the cons. Also, how was Gibson's craftsmanship, Guild's craftsmanship, excuse me, back then compared to today?" Well, course, back in 1954, the Aristocrat model M75. First, let's look up and see in the handy dandy guide just when the Aristocrat was introduced, because 54 would certainly be very, very early. That would be, so let us gaze upon that. Okay. Aristocrat in 75. The guild workmanship of the 50s was not better than guild's workmanship today, but it was a very different company. Guild started out in New York and shortly thereafter moved to Hoboken, New Jersey, and then in the late 60s moved to Westerly, Rhode Island, and later was bought by Fender. Fender moved production for a while to Tacoma, Washington, and later to New Hartford, Connecticut, in the former Ovation factory. So Guild's workmanship varies. Now, today, Guilds are made in China and in California. The California-made Guilds have excellent workmanship and would have workmanship that was certainly fully equivalent, if not better, than some of the early Guilds. And that this is a matter that in 54 would be one of the absolute earliest of any production for Guild. So this would be very, very, very early for a M75. In fact, I think some difficulty right now looking up exactly what year the M75 was introduced. Probably do is have to get Joe to check that, but the fact is the M75 is copied now, and there are new versions made in Korea, which were remarkably good workmanship to the point where they rival some of the old ones. And that sort of becomes a sticky situation if you're buying one for collectability. The old M75 had a pressed laminated spruce top and had mahogany back and sides. It looked like a solid body guitar, but it was fully hollow, and it was a featherweight instrument. The new ones are every bit as good, and there have been other versions, such as back in 1985, I designed a model that was to some extent inspired by that model, but it had a routed back, and the Nightbird model had a carved top. In my opinion, was actually a far superior guitar to the M75. But an exact copy of the M75 Aristocrat would be a very lightweight guitar, which would be prone to feedback, and they had single coil pickups made by Franz. They were good quality pickups, similar to a Gibson P90 pickup. Hold one moment, please. Get Joe to look up exact production dates on the M75 Aristocrat build.
Yep.
I need that. So we'll have that information momentarily. So I'd like to, I'll return to revisit that because it does show, among other things, that I have not achieved omniscience yet. I cannot remember the exact introduction date for the M75, but I'm somewhat skeptical about it being as early as 54, but we'll soon see. So we will revisit that question very shortly. Nicholas asks, what are the main differences between the Gibson L5 Super 400 and Citation archtop models? Which of these are the most sought after by jazz players? Again, the question is perhaps not quite as simple as it seems on the surface. The L5 model was introduced in 1923, but I only know of one made that year. 24, they made still a very small number, all signed by Lloyd Lord on master model labels at that time, through late 1924. And at that time, the L5 was a 16-inch wide dot inlay on the fingerboard, the Gibson and flower pot Peghead inlay, but 16-inch wide, triple binding on the body. And the earliest ones had birch back and sides, and later ones had maple. By the tail end of 24, they had maple back. But it was Gibson's top of the line model. It was $275 new, which at that time was $10 more than a Model T Ford. And there were no other archtop models in the Gibson line. By 1935, Gibson came out with the so-called advanced models, and the L5 was ramped up to be a 17-inch guitar. But from the introduction of the guitar, 1923 through 1934, the L5 was Gibson's top of the line archtop guitar. In fact, for much of the 20s, it was their only archtop guitar in the catalog. They made a few L10 guitars very, very late, like 29. There were a few, but they were not even in the catalog yet. Get someone else to look it up.
Aristocrat.
M75. The Super 400, some folks thought was introduced in 1934, but the research today on Gibson serial numbers and on shipping ledgers has shown us that actually the Super 400 was not introduced until 1935. In fact, I have a prototype L5 special 18-inch wide guitar made in early 1935 that predates the Super 400, which came out later in that same year. But the Super 400 had an 18-inch wide body and was the top of the line Gibson guitar from its introduction in 1935 onward until after World War II. There was really nothing in a more expensive archtop in the Gibson catalog until the Citation came out in '69. But the Super 400 had split block inlays were starting in 35. The L5 had block pearl inlays on the 17-inch model. Pearl inlay, in fact, actually in very late, early 30s, by 1930, Gibson L5s had pearloid block inlays on the 16-inch model, starting at the 3rd fret, but by 1935 they had pearl blocks starting at the 1st fret, and they had multiple bindings on the neck, body, and pickguard edges. They really fancied them up. But the Super 400 went further. It had a long peghead, split diamond-shaped peghead inlays, and split block inlays on the fingerboard. So it was an 18-inch wide guitar. Now, it cost more money. The L5 was $275 plus case. The Super 400 was $400 with case, and the early cases were genuine leather-covered fancy cases. So it was a very expensive guitar, but it also came with a very expensive case. Many professional players actually preferred the L5 because at 17 inches for the advanced L5 and 18 with a very wide waist, the Super 400 was, for many smaller folks, really quite uncomfortable and awkward to hold. So it really didn't sell nearly as well as the L5, partly because of the price and partly because it was, frankly, not necessarily better sounding. The L5 had a great rhythm sound. Super 400s were quite variable. My personal experience is some of them sounded really good, and many of them didn't put out the volume or the punch that a good L5 had for playing rhythm. But both models were top of the line. For a good bit of the time, the L5 was definitely the top of the line. Once the Super 400 was introduced, it cost more than the L5, but it was not necessarily regarded by most players as necessarily being a better guitar for their purposes. And another example of something like that would be the Gibson Sunburst Les Paul, which was $265 new in 1959, and the Gibson Les Paul Custom, which was $375, which most players opted for the Les Paul Standard. It had 2 pickups, which they found more versatile than the 3 pickups with a weird switch system on the Les Paul Custom, because on the Les Paul Custom, the middle position gave you the middle pickup and the bridge position pickup out of phase with each other for super twang, but it didn't offer you the option of a good sounding middle position that you could get on the Sunburst Les Paul. Plus the Custom was jet black and you didn't see the grain of the wood, whereas on the Sunburst Les Paul, especially if it had pretty curly maple, the Sunburst finish was transparent and you could see beautiful wood grain. At any rate, today, the Sunburst Les Pauls bring vastly more money than the Les Paul Custom, in spite of the fact that the Custom, when new, cost more. Then we get on now to the Citation. The Citation was a 17-inch wide guitar. It was a full-depth body, carved back, carved top. It had sort of cloud-shaped inlays on the fingerboard, multiple bindings, gold plating. It cost more money than the Super 400, considerably more. And they touted it as having tap tune top and back and air chamber. And it was supposed to be the absolute top of the line, but professional musicians simply didn't gravitate toward it. The few people who did buy one typically were folks who fancied themselves as collectors, and they just didn't really use them on stage. I'm hard pressed to think of a single professional musician who used a Citation guitar on stage. I know of people who collected them just for the bragging rights that this is the most expensive. And I also remember vividly that I visited the factory in 1969 along with my partner, Tut Taylor, who was my partner in business for the first 9 months of Washburn Guitars, which was back then GTR Incorporated for George, Tut, and Randy. And we visited the factory and saw the actual production work being done on the Citation. And one of the things that blew my mind is the guy who was doing the tap tuning was using a electronic tuning device where he could see a needle that gave him the pitch, much like we have electronic tuners today, but he was deaf. He was stone deaf, could lip read, could not hear a human voice, could not hear music, could not certainly hear a guitar, but he was the guy doing the tap tuning. But he could tap tune to a frequency by looking at the screen, or as a dial. It wasn't a digital screen, it was a dial with a needle, and he could tap tune from that. But the model was only made from 69 through 70, limited, very limited number. But then it was reissued with virtually the same specs from 79 through 83. And then for a decade, it was out of production and was reintroduced again from 93, and then continuous production until 2018, whereupon it was discontinued again. And it is, at this point, currently no longer in production. But what goes through the whole history of the Citation model is that it was a model designed more to be put in a glass case as a conversation piece rather than really being used on stage to produce music. There's obviously examples of other manufacturers and other models that sort of fall into that same category now. The PRS Dragon is a magnificent piece of craftsmanship, but I don't see them being used on stage. Martin made D50 and D100 guitars that are the ultimate in fancy ornamentation, but again, I don't see them being used on stage. And at the NAMM shows for several years, the Beyond the NAMM traveling shows for showing off boutique guitars, a great number of those also are items that I just don't see being used on stage. So guitars can be utilitarian, but they also can be bragging right items, and you can find the same thing with firearms, occasionally cars, and all sorts of items. But if somebody buys an engraved pistol with ivory or pearl grips, and there's carving, there's engraving, there's inlay, and occasionally even gold plating, nobody's going to actually shoot the thing. It's not for hunting, it's not for self-defense, it's not for target practice. It's like if you shot the thing, you'd actually get powder burns on it and it would go down in value. It's sort of like collectible coins, collectible postage stamps. You wouldn't actually think of licking the stamp and putting it on an envelope, mailing anything with it, especially if it's a vintage stamp. It wouldn't even be good for that. But if you did anything with a coin, like actually touch it, you'd get finger grease on it, and you can't clean that. It's going to be permanently devalued, though, if you've even as much as touched it with your bare fingers. So, at any rate, that's what I can say on that. Now, Adam has a question. He says, I'm in the market for a vintage steel string acoustic, an OM model. Not looking for a real investment per se, but I don't want to lose money either. If I should ever need to unload it. Any recommendations of what to look at and what to expect to pay, etc. This is one that as far as the OM model, that's a Martin designation. And if you want to talk about a vintage steel string acoustic, the OM was introduced in late 1929, and they did not make OM models after 1933 until reintroducing it much, much later. So it depends on how one defines vintage, but the OMs that would be considered vintage are very expensive guitars. And if you're looking for a utilitarian tool that is priced under $20,000, then you're not looking for an old Martin OM for the original first issue OMs that I would consider to be true vintage. There are obviously Martin OMs that are reissues, including some that we make right now. We do our own Grand Design OMs, and those are readily available. I've shown them previously during our question and answer sessions, but they are on our website, guitars.com. You can easily look them up. But an OM by definition is a 15-inch wide guitar, typically 4 1/8 inches deep, and typically a 25.4-inch scale. So it's effectively the same size as a Martin Triple O, except that the Triple O guitars after late 34 had a 24.9-inch scale. But again, there are other companies today making OM models, Collings, Santa Cruz, Dalton, and quite a few boutique builders that make guitars of that size and general specs, but I would not consider them to be vintage. So if you're talking about a vintage steel string acoustic guitar, an OM model, the only ones there are the Martin OM18, OM28, OM45, and OM45 Deluxe. And those models were not done prior to late 1929 and not done after late 1933. And none of those are probably going to be, if you're not looking for a real investment per se, well, I don't know what your price bracket is, but all of those are, if they're in good condition, investment grade guitars. A good OM18 can certainly push $30,000 or more, and the OM28s significantly more. And the OM45s, we're talking about prices that can be $200,000 plus. So the other OMs available on the market, by my definition, are not vintage guitars. But if you want a good OM guitar, some of the new Martins happen to be very good. They are better, in my opinion, than much of what Martin made 50 years ago, and even better in many cases than what Martin made 60 years ago. Not better than what Martin made during the 1930s, but approaching it. The new Martins are very good guitars. And there are obviously other makers such as Collings and Santa Cruz. There's numerous enough others that make guitars, acoustics that are quite good, but not necessarily investments in terms of appreciation. I can't, again, my crystal ball right here doesn't necessarily tell me about appreciation for 20, 30, 40, 50 years in advance. I have had folks ask me, how much is my guitar going to be worth in 10 years or even 20? A guy asked me how much his guitar is going to be worth in 50. Well, if you look close, you can see if you hold something straight up to it, it does give you a magnified view of exactly what's there. right side up, but if you take it away from any distance, the image is flipped and everything's upside down. And you can see even there in the distance, all those guitars behind me, they'd be upside down according to the crystal ball. And that gives you about as much view as what the market's doing. We don't have a really clear, undistorted, right side up view of what the market will be 10, 20, 30, 40 years in the future. But we do know that at least at the present time, the demographics of the market indicate that the younger baby boomers are buying, the millennials are having a midlife crisis and they're buying, the children of the millennials who are now puberty through age 20, they're buying. So we have at least 3 generations who are buying. Younger baby boomers, those born from the period maybe 56 or 7 through mid-60s, those people are buying. And they're actively buying. And then the millennials born starting around 1980, somebody born in the 1980s, 41 years old now, they're very actively buying, and their children are too. So we have pent-up demand after the pandemic. But pent-up demand after a pandemic, it's not going to last forever. That's something that might last maybe a year. But the demographic trends I'm talking about could produce 7 to 10 years of strong sales, as long as we don't screw up the economy. John Parsons says, my first guitar as a kid was a Martin Sigma acoustic guitar. It was a gift from my parents in 1980. Still remember the intoxicating smell of that first guitar. Wish I still had it. What's the story behind those guitars? Why did Martin stop importing them? They were made in Korea, and they were decent quality Korean imports, but prices of Korean products started to go up significantly. And those did not really compete well in quality with Martin. And they really weren't better in quality than Korean imports that numerous other companies had. Therefore, Martin just elected to stop doing those and concentrate on what they do best. So there are no more Sigma guitars. I have gotten some information regarding the production dates on the M75 Aristocrat. They were made starting in late 1954 through 1963. A 54 model would be very, very scarce item, extremely rare guitar. The model in general is rare. They were $210 new when introduced in 54, but keeping in mind that 210 was a whole lot more money back then than it is now. For example, in 54, the gold top Les Paul did not cost much more than that. And the price in 1963, when this model was discontinued, was $280. But the Aristocrat, while it looks like a solid body guitar, is featherweight and absolutely does not sound like a solid body guitar. It is a different beast of its own. And they're popular because they look neat. They're certainly physically comfortable to play. They're lightweight, which is easy on your back, but does it produce the resulting sound and the volume attainable with a solid body guitar? The answer is no. Um, so Tom Goodhue asks, what is the guitar behind George's left shoulder with the Banjo Tuners? Well, I was going to actually bring that up. So why I put it within reach, I wanted to show it. This is a guitar made by Orville Gibson. The label, which you can see, try to get it, you can see it a bit there. The O.H. Gibson label. This is before the Gibson Company existed. Gibson as a company existed starting in 1902 when Lewis Williams and a group of other Kalamazoo businessmen bought Orville's patent. But this is an interesting guitar. His carving pattern on the top is somewhat like a archtop standard guitar. The pattern on the back is extremely different. It's actually quite flat on the back, but carved very sharply on the edges. And the construction of the heel of the neck is completely Orville and nobody else like it. This has the sides going all the way up to here, being one piece, and then the neck has a joint. It's not easy to see on camera, but you can see a bit here, this lighter area right here. This piece is, along with the sides, a piece that goes all around, and then the rest of the neck up here goes onward and down. And then it has a separate fingerboard with the dot inlays. This peghead is what they call the paddle peghead, and someone has messed up and put some sloppy inlay in there that we're going to have to redo the peghead veneer. But it does have a veneer on the peghead, so we can restore it to proper appearance because the rest of it is proper appearance. And this is an extraordinarily rare item. We're really not sure exactly how many instruments Orville produced in his lifetime, but what we do know is that he didn't keep any records. So, or at least none have been found. The number of Orville instruments is exceedingly small. His significance in the guitar world would not be great had it not been for him selling his patent to a company which went on to take his designs and rework them into things that were easier for production and which have become very significant in the world of guitars, banjos, and mandolins. So Orville himself would probably be virtually forgotten if he had never sold his patent, which resulted in a company making these instruments in quantity, but also modifying his designs into designs that truly would be saleable in quantity. But his instruments have gone on to be extremely significant. So, and I wish I could give you more precise figures on how many Orville instruments exist today, but nobody seems to have a good reckoning of that. But what we do know is there's very, very few. So his importance is much, much greater than could be determined just from how many guitars he made, as well as mandolins and harp guitars. But Orville probably made equally many, if not more, mandolins than he did guitars. But his designs have been changed so much as to be almost unrecognizable, other than the fact that there's carved tops and carved backs. But what we do see is that he had a basic body shape that is still very much similar to some of the Gibson guitars made today. The L5 shape, the J185, Gibson Jumbo shape is still very much there. It's not identical, but it's close. And his mandolins had body shapes that also are reminiscent of what followed. His early scroll model mandolins had peghead shape, was still very much what they use today on the artist model Gibsons, and the body shape is similar, although it had an extra point. But it was a color 2 scroll, had a point right where that joins the body, and that was eliminated by 1910, but otherwise the body shape is remarkably similar. So Orville's artistic and structural concepts are still present in today's Gibson instruments, although they've been modified considerably. But he, in spite of very, very low production, is a person who'd have to be considered one of the most influential makers in the history of American fretted instruments, because he at least planted the seed that sprouted into something remarkably significant. We have a question from Marty Cohen. It says, I recently acquired a 1965 mahogany Harmony Sovereign that was professionally retopped in X-brace using 4 very old boards from wine crates. I believe they are pine. What is it? The guitar sounds wonderful, as good as some vintage Martins and Gibsons I've had. It's changed my view of what it takes to make a guitar sound good. Well, it is true that you can get good sound out of even sometimes mediocre wood. What I would expect out of wine crates is not going to be as good as some of the finest wood on acoustic guitars, such as Martins and Gibsons. But you can get good sound if the design work is good and if it has the right bracing pattern. So far as are they as good as some of the vintage Martins? Well, I guess maybe the key word there is some of them. Not all are equally good condition or equally good sounding, but on vintage Martins and Gibsons of models that are noted for good sound, the right models, it's rare to find one that's in good condition that sounds poor. And typically they sound extremely good. And do I think that his Martin, that the Martins he played, if they were not as good or better than this converted harmony, I would have to say something's wrong with the Martins. But my ear tells me that old Martins and old Gibsons from the Golden Age period sound way better than any converted harmony I have heard. I've seen quite a few of those converted harmonies. Some of them are pretty good, but do they equal the good 1930s Martin style 18 on up through the top levels? The answer is no, they don't. Richard Schaefer asked George, would you consider as original a Fender Stratocaster that would have been repainted by the seller as soon as it arrived in London in '62? I mean, it goes with the history of the guitar at that time. Well, yeah, but it's still modified. And would I consider it to be original? No. It's original if it's the way it left the factory. It may still have collectible value. Certainly Selmer, when they were distributing Fenders in England in the 60s, did indeed repaint a lot of them, often painting over the original Sunburst, because Hank Marvin, others wanted solid color, custom color Fenders, and since Fender was shipping out Sunbursts, their distributors, Selmer, would repaint guitars, and often just, as I said, just simply spraying over the originals. But that doesn't mean that they're original. They how they were originally sold by Selmer, but are they factory original? No. Are they worth as much as a factory original custom color? The answer is no, they're not. Are they still of value? Yes. And if they were owned by a celebrity performer, sometimes that takes precedence over the originality from the factory. But if Hank Marvin had it and it was a repainted guitar, well, somebody's going to buy it because it was his. And we've already seen cases where at auction, memorabilia items will bring huge prices. But that does not mean that they are, by definition, original. Original, it means that it's the way it left the factory, those specs, and not redone. But still, they can be a good guitar, even if they are refinished, but they're not original and not the same value. Bill Tate says, I have a Gibson ES335. It's been in my closet for 35 years. I took the parts off to refinish the guitar back then, and the factory Bigsby and bridge were stolen. The body is primed, the binding is removed. I'd like to make the guitar play again. Should I just do it myself, or is this guitar worth sending back to Gibson for restoration? I have the original pickups and electronics. Well, if you do it yourself, what it's going to be worth is going to be dependent on how good your quality of work is. And what you did to it before you put it in the closet, taking the parts off, refinishing it, removing the binding. And, it was, your guitar from a collector's point of view is ruined. From a utility point of view, if you put a lot of money into it, it may still turn out to be a good utility tool. What it's going to be worth afterward is going to be dependent very much on who does that work. You don't have to necessarily send it back to Gibson. There are folks who do that kind of work. And so there are actually numerous shops that are able to do a good refinish job and a restoration, but depending on how good the job is, that's going to impact the value of the guitar afterward. And since you started it and did that, which was, I think, a very ill-advised thing to do at the time, unless over the years you have studied the craft such that you can do a factory quality job, then you should not dig a deeper hole by doing more of it yourself. You should find someone highly qualified to do that work, which does not necessarily mean it has to be Gibson. But there are a number of makers and restoration shops that do that kind of work. They vary greatly in quality, and I'm not going to make recommendations on air regarding who to take it to. But if you call us, we could certainly discuss it further. But the value, again, is going to be very much dependent on how you handle it from here. It will never be valuable as a collectible because of what's been done, but you could at least make it into a good utility tool if the work is done properly. If the work is poorly done, your guitar will be pretty well trashed. Chuck Peterson asks, what is your store's policy for internationally shipping an instrument that has endangered species of wood such as Brazilian rosewood fingerboard? Well, to do it legally, one must follow the rules, CITES Treaty, International Trade in Endangered Species, and also Lacey Act, which regulates in the USA sales of products that have restrictions and need permits. if you ship them internationally without a permit, or if you do anything to violate the Lacey Act within the USA, these are serious offenses. Our policy is quite simple. We follow the law. In some cases, the law is such that it is so burdensome that getting the permits, time, the expense, doing it, and the fact that after all that is done, it would be impractical to ship instruments on approval means that we'll just sell it in the USA and not try to ship those overseas. And instruments with ivory are way too difficult to ship overseas. It is possible that you can spend a year trying to get the paperwork done. As far as importing one with ivory, that's simply verboten. You cannot get the paperwork to do it. You cannot do it legally, and it's a serious offense if you're caught doing that. It is not worth the risk, especially when we have a market within the USA where it is legal to ship and to sell these items. So our policy is extremely simple. We follow the law. We do not recommend breaking the law, and we do advise people that if they are caught breaking the law, that the penalties for violating CITES and Lacey are very severe. Paul Mitchell says, hi, George, bought my 71 Telly from you in 1994 when I was visiting from the UK. Well, back then, 71 Telly would not have had, back then and still today, 71 Telly doesn't have any components, materials that are anything but legal. They have no endangered species on them. It's still a good guitar, but no problem shipping those. So that's something that we're happy to do. Happy to do it then, happy to do it still today. John Parsons says, I know Billy Gibbons is a friend, was wondering if you had a relationship with Dusty Hill as well. Great performer. Needless to say, Dusty is going to be greatly missed. He did not spend much time with Grim Guitars. Billy was the guitar player, of course, and he's the one that I did a lot of business with, spent a good bit of time with. I never really got to know Dusty or Beard, but the fact is, they were great musicians. They're all, those who are still alive are great musicians, and Dusty was a great musician. And ZZ Top is a group that is going to be remembered for many, many, many years. How they will continue from here without Dusty remains to be seen. But with or without Dusty, ZZ Top is going to be important, whether they record anything more or perform again in any new version. Already, Billy does quite a few shows on his own, and I'm sure he'll continue to do that. So, but again, my condolences to Dusty's family and to those who remain in the group. I know for myself that when I was hit 50, I was going to more funerals than I had previous, and but they were still for folks older than me. It was somewhat abstract. And when I hit 60, I was going to more funerals yet, and they were still typically for folks older than me, but hitting 70, and I'll be 76 August 21st, I get to go to a lot more funerals, and when you hit 70, you discover that now half the funerals are for people your own age or younger. And that is a sobering thought and somewhat difficult adjustment psychologically for many people, me included. But at 76, I have no intention of retiring, and I still enjoy what I do. On the other hand, I don't have to do much that I don't like to do. So when I come in is daily to do things, meet and greet, do some wheeling and dealing, write, and generally think of new model designs, new business strategies, but I particularly enjoy designing new model instruments and talking to people. I may teach them some things, they may teach me things, but if you keep an open mind and listen as well as talk, there's the potential to learn an enormous amount. Almost everybody who comes in knows more about something than I do. It may or may not have any relation to the guitar market, but even with respect to guitars, I find that there's still a lot yet to learn. So Ken asked, do you have any info on Gibson's use of a balsa wood center block on the ES-135? I don't know their use of balsa on that particular model. I do know that they used balsa in the center of some of the Chet Atkins models made back in the 1980s. And Gibson used it because it's lightweight, but it would fill the space so that you could cut weight, but also keep feedback to a minimum. And just as Corina wood is Gibson's trade name for African limba wood, then chromite was Gibson's trade name for balsa. So they didn't call it balsa in their catalogs. They called it chromite, as that makes it more mysterious and perhaps in their mind more marketable. I'd like to show one thing that I found at the NAMM show that I find quite interesting, and that is mandolins made in Kansas City by Kansas City String Shop. A.K. Anton Kreutz, who is the owner of that, and one of his luthiers, Alexander Svistonov, who has done guitars for me in years past with this violin-like edge. You can pop the top if anything goes wrong, but it's fascinating that so far as sound, this is the first time I've been at a trade show or any other show where I encountered new mandolins that sounded as good and actually better than almost any vintage instruments I've ever played. I cannot in truth say that I've ever played any vintage mandolin that in my opinion sounded better than this does. And right now, it consists of only two prototypes. This is prototype 1, and I also have prototype 2, but he has a production capacity of as much as maybe one instrument a month. And I bought 2 prototypes, and I've put in the order to buy all he can make for me. I'm not going to play it because I find that playing on a setting like this does not produce a real true representation of the sound. And recordings in general don't really capture true acoustic sound. If I were to play this next to old Gibson F5 mandolins from the 1920s and 30s, it would sound good, but could you really tell the subtleties of difference or of volume and dynamic range in a recording such as I could do today that you could listen to on your computer or headphones? The answer is no, it wouldn't. But what I can say is that if anybody wants to come in and actually play and hear what these can do, we have 4 F5 lower model mandolins made 23 and 24. We have 2 1931 F5s. We have 3 Gilchrist mandolins. We have a Monteleone mandolin. We have other very fine mandolins such as Paul Newsom. And I put this up against any of them. It's quite amazing what it can do. And both prototypes are amazing mandolins. I've never seen anything built this way before in a mandolin, but just in the past week, it has been brought to my attention that these are not the first ever done like this. There is a maker in Vermont who's been doing instruments similar to this in design that have gotten some attention, but they've never been shown at a trade show that I know of. They've never been advertised anywhere that I'd seen, and no customer of mine has ever walked in with one that I've gotten the chance to hear or play. But this is not the first time somebody with violin making experience has sought to put their experience into mandolin design. I also was shown online the instruments made by a maker in the UK with similar construction, although he and the Vermont maker also don't make only the artist model with his scroll buckles like F5. They also make the A model style that is more pear shaped, more like this type shape. Eliminate the points and the scroll, you have basically an A model. Or they've made also some 2-point symmetrical body, which would come out looking sort of like this, 2 points being symmetrical. And those can sound good, but again, I've seen those now in photos, and I've been told that they're quite good. But these, I have 2 examples here that I know I've played, and that they are mind-boggling, spectacularly good. So that's something that I found at the NAMM show that was hidden away fairly well because it was in an exhibit showing upright basses, cellos, violas, and violins, and 1 mandolin on display. But when I saw that, I zeroed in on it and very quickly discovered that it was a remarkable instrument. So now I've got those 2, and if people are interested, you know how to reach me. Ruined Guitars, phone number 615-256-2033, and my personal email, george@guitars.com. And I enjoy these question and answer sessions, and needless to say, they are very impromptu, and as you can see, I'm not always omniscient either. I did not have right away the production dates on the Guild Aristocrat, but I can tell you I have experience having owned and played Aristocrats, and I still would maintain that they are not superior as far as workmanship to the new ones. Guild has very good workmanship on their USA-made, California-made instruments, and the import models produced currently by Guild, imported primarily from China, are actually remarkably good. But at any rate, I'll look forward to next week. Send those questions. The more challenging the questions are, the more interesting it is. And if you can get some of those questions to me in advance of the show, I would obviously have more time to research answers, but I'm happy to handle them on the fly as well. So if they come in during the show, I'll do my best to answer each and every one of them. But in the meantime, I'm reachable, George@guitars.com. Have a good one.